Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40, created and hosted by me, journalist and author Sam Baker. My guest today, Fatima Bhutto, knows more than most about loss and living with a traumatic family legacy. Fatima is descended from one of Pakistan's most prominent political dynasties. When she was just 14, her father, the politician Murtaza Bhutto, was killed by his political opponents during the premiership of his sister, Benazir Bhutto. Fatima's grandfather, the former president and prime minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, was also killed by the state. I tell you this because despite now being a prominent writer and speaker in her own right, Fatima would be the first to admit how much this shaped her. Now 43, she's the author of 2 novels, including the Women's Prize long-listed The Shadow of the Crescent Moon, and 3 works of non-fiction. The most recent is The Hour of the Wolf, an unflinching memoir about the decade Fatima spent in a coercive relationship in her 30s, and her beloved dog, Coco, the Jack Russell Terrier who became her lifeline.
I was quite wounded when I met him, but it only occurred to me much later that he was grooming me as well, in a way, for how to deal with his behavior, which was to teach me to forget pain, to teach me to alter my memories, to teach me that I never had to focus on anything that made me uncomfortable. I never had to confront it. I could put it away and keep going. I could live in the present moment without any real confrontation or reckoning of what the past meant.
Fatima joined me to talk candidly about the single dad she adored, the impact of intergenerational trauma, and her longing for motherhood. We also discussed why no one is immune from coercion, learning to let go of shame, toxic self-esteem, how it feels to be older than her father, and wait for it, I promise there's some joy, being a dog lady. And yes, there is a happy ever after. I should warn you though, there is discussion of coercive control from the outset. Thank you so much for coming on The Shift, Fatima. It's really lovely to see you. Where shall we start? I suppose, I read the book and I read it again and it's phenomenal. It's tough. It's a tough read. Was it a tough write?
It really was, actually, mainly because when I first wrote the book, when I had the first draft of the book, I left a lot out. Something was missing, it didn't really work as a book. And I kept going back and trying to add things that weren't the thing I was ashamed of saying. It just didn't work as a book until I was ready really to confront the truth of the whole matter and my shame. And once I did, it became what it is. And I was able to let go and to process a lot as well.
What was the thing that you were ashamed of saying?
I was really ashamed of letting myself be treated badly because I had built an idea up in my head of myself as a strong, independent, tough woman. And I am those things. I was those things, but I still somehow found myself in a relationship that was coercive, where I was unhappy, but I was so broken and it played on the worst of my fears that I didn't really quite realize what I'd accepted,
I think there's an idea, isn't there, that this kind of mythical idea that there are certain people that this can't happen to. And often when you get down to it, and for the sake of transparency, when I was very much younger, I was in a similar situation. So I definitely found some elements of the book quite near the knuckle. But I think there's an idea that, it couldn't happen to you because you're X, Y, or Z. And the truth is it can happen to anybody.
Actually, Sam, I think it does happen to everybody. And sorry about that.
Yeah, no, don't worry. That's fine. He can yell in the background.
Okay. I think the truth is that it does happen to everybody. And I think the reason we have this story of there are some people who are immune is because we are ashamed and because we're not willing to talk about it. Even though years on, I didn't want to admit certain things about myself, like that I tolerated it, that I tolerated emotional abuse and gaslighting for years and years and years. I didn't want to admit it about myself because I also felt it weakened me, not just for me, but, to survive in the world we live in is a rough job. It's not easy, to survive in the world we live in that is often cold and cruel and exacting. Is hard enough without having to admit that we fail and that we are weak. We do things we are ashamed of. And I didn't want to add to that, experience that was already challenging. But I felt I had to because once I started writing, I had wished so often that someone had told me those things. And if they had about themselves, I might have seen myself in those stories and I might have snapped out of it. I might not have, but
yeah, it's really struck me actually that a lot of the things that we now take for granted in a kind of in a language sense, in a what's common parlance, gaslighting and red flags, and they even 10 years ago, they just weren't part of the conversation in the same way. So you can be forgiven you can be forgiven anyway, but you can be, not that you even need it, but you can be forgiven for not saying a red flag since we weren't talking about red flags. And it's easy with the benefit of hindsight to look back and say, oh, especially if you've been in it, oh, those things some of the things he did and said,
Yeah, I mean, up until the point that we were looking at the copy for the book's cover, I was still saying to my editors, can't we just call this a book about a dog?
Yeah. And it is in some ways.
It is in some ways. But, oh, bye, baby. Bye. Sorry. I just thought it was still humiliating to me. I mean, up until months ago, up until really the first time I had to start talking about the book. And then I thought, if I'm this ashamed, what does someone else feel? And then I thought, well, actually, do you know what? I will take the shame. I'll take all the shame, frankly, if it can help other women come out and say, I was treated badly and I don't accept that. I don't accept to be treated badly in any area of my life. And I don't have to. And I don't have to think I've failed because I made the error of judgment in a relationship or with my family. And so now I've just kind of accepted it and surrendered myself to it. And also, as you said, the conversation has to include these things, because what are we talking about if we don't talk about the shameful thing?
And it is that, shame is such a powerful tool, isn't it? And it's what keeps us separate, and sounds a bit melodramatic, but suffering in isolation rather than knowing that we're not alone. I would like to talk a bit more about the relationship, if that's okay. But before we do, can we talk a little bit about what made you who you are? So I guess growing up as a Bhutto and your childhood.
Well, I was raised by a single father pretty much till I was 7, 8 years old. My father's father was killed just years before I was born. My father was in exile. My family really had been devastated by a military coup that took place in 1977 in Pakistan. I was born in 1982. And so the family I was born into was one that was in grief, really, in disarray. My grandmother spent long periods under house arrest, my aunts. I was not born in my country. I didn't even go back to Pakistan until I think it was 7 years old. And so by all accounts, I should have been born into a very sad, tragic, maudlin environment. But my father was a spectacular father. He sheltered me from a lot of that with love. Some of it I couldn't be sheltered from. I knew what had happened. I knew things were dangerous. So it was always in the background, but he was a really loving father, and he was a very warm and nurturing father. And I really do think I've survived this far in life because of my father's love, because he taught me that love is unconditional and it's joyous, and it's something you wake up and you thank God and the universe for every day. And you give of it freely. When I was 14 years old and we had returned back to Pakistan, and my father had entered politics and he was an MP in Pakistan, he was killed outside of our house while I was inside. He had remarried by then, and I had a young brother. My father being killed in such a devastating way was something that I knew was always a possibility, but I had prayed and hoped that it wouldn't happen so soon. And when it did, I was 14 years old and just heartbroken. And I remained heartbroken for, well, really forever, in a sense. And so the business of growing up, of being a teenager, of becoming a young woman was always secondary to that grief that I had. And I carried around with me like a sort of ticking time bomb, I suppose. When I went to college and I studied, and I started to suffer very bad panic attacks. But again, I came from this not only family, but environment where I was told you had to be brave and you had to, get on and do what had to be done, regardless of what had happened to you. And I'm certainly aware that of my privilege and that I'm lucky. I don't go to sleep hungry. I go to sleep in a warm house. And so it did feel selfish in a way to feel like I couldn't go on. So I did. And when I finished studying, I became a writer. And, I wrote about difficult things. I wrote about my father's killing and his assassination in my first book. And so I never really shied away from the things that had hurt me. I did want to look at them. I did want to confront them. That hurt too. And I learned that grief isn't something that you get over. Grief just moves with you as you move in life. It just changes shape and changes form as you change shape and form. So that's really where I was when we began The Hour of the Wolf, I suppose.
Because you haven't, as you said, you have never really you haven't shied away from writing about addressing the really tough stuff. But I was interested that you say, do you know what? I've read so many things. I think you say it in The Hour of the Wolf, I could be wrong, about at the point when you were doing the tour for the book about your father's murder, that you were losing your voice. In a way, it comes back to shame because shame is silencing. But I am fascinated by the way women's voices are silenced. Looking back, can you remember the losing your voice and what was happening beyond the fact that you were having to stand on stage every night and talk about the worst thing that had ever happened in your life?
Yeah. Well, when I had written that book, I was in my 20s. I mean, I was 28 when it came out. And I had spent 6 years basically traveling all over the world, finding people who knew my father, from, his great love as a young man, to his college professors, to his roommates, to police officers who were on the scene that night when he was killed. It was a difficult book in that regard because it was very emotional. It was very personal. And it took me 6 years to do because it really was overwhelming to confront a lot of these things. But the country I lived in, Pakistan, didn't give me any hope for justice. So I did not think that the men who killed my father would ever. And they didn't. They were powerful men. They were men in politics. They were men in the police. And in fact, they were promoted again and again and again. So the men who killed my father still work in government. They still work in the police force. They still work in the bureaucracy in my country. I understood that against power, you don't really have much protection against the revenge or the violence of power. And I had to think that justice was available somewhere else. And I had told myself it was in memory. It was in telling the story. It was in keeping the story alive. It was in witnessing and reckoning. And the book, when it came out, I said, I will go anywhere you ask me to go with this book, and I will talk about it, and I will do it for as long as necessary. And I didn't realize, naively, how punishing that would be. Because, of course, I wasn't talking about it with friends or with empathetic, compassionate people. I was often talking about it with interlocutors who didn't feel very bad about asking me incredibly personal questions, detailed. It felt a bit like voyeurs in a car crash at points, because they were not gentle, and maybe also because I wanted to be tough. So I also didn't say, I don't think I can do this event. Even when I didn't feel I could do it, I still went and did it. It started pretty early. It was probably in the second month of the tour, or that I noticed a pain in my throat. And I thought, it was springtime. I thought the weather changing. And I started to lose my voice. And I went to doctors. There was nothing wrong. There was no infection. There was no vocal tearing, no nothing. It was the body saying, I can't do this anymore. I can't talk about this. Not just once a night. Sometimes it was press in the morning, an interview in the afternoon, and then again at night. And I had sprays, teas, anything you can think of I was taking. And it just wouldn't go away really until I stopped that tour. And I found this again and again in my life when I'm really stressed, because I'm hard on myself, as I think a lot of people are. I won't stop. I push myself until my body tells me it can't take anymore. And that was losing my voice. Yeah.
It's so interesting, isn't it? That when you reach a point where your body basically has to intervene because your mind won't listen to it. And I have definitely been there too, where, you reach a point where your body just takes you out because it's the only way to get you to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Absolutely. I mean, throughout the period that I wrote about in The Hour of the Wolf, I had debilitating stomach attacks. Like I had stomach pain that was so severe, I couldn't stand up at points. And again, there was nothing wrong at that moment with my stomach. It was a stress response, a trauma response. But we don't listen. We don't tend to listen. And even today, I really have to focus my attention on my body long enough to listen to it, which I don't often do.
I was going to say, do you feel more able now you're, into your early 40s and you've lived through all of this over and over and over? Do you feel more able to say, actually, no, stop, enough?
It's interesting you say that, because just 10 days ago, I had anxiety so severe, I did think I was having a heart attack. I'm not sure I listen more, but I've become faster at identifying it. So instead of thinking I was having a heart attack for a month or a week, it took me 24 hours to say, oh, wait, hang on. Maybe this isn't my heart. Maybe this is just anxiety. So I think I've become better at recognizing it, but I'm still working on.
Might be a forever thing, I think, with a lot of people.
Possibly.
Earlier, when you were talking about your dad, you talked about him teaching you that love was unconditional. The relationship that you write about in The Hour of the Wolf. And I must just say, please tell me to mind my own business if at any point I'm I'm a voyeur at a car crash. I really don't want to be that. But I realize I am asking you prurient questions. So your father taught you that love was unconditional. And yet the relationship the book is about, not the relationship with Coco the dog, which is very much unconditional. And I promise we will talk about. But the other relationship, the relationship that brought on the stomach, that could not have been less unconditional, could it?
No, it was incredibly conditional, though I didn't see it that way at the time. And it was conditional on my behavior, which is possibly the worst thing. Because in that relationship, if I questioned anything, if I dissented, if I disagreed or I argued back, then not only was affection withheld or love threatened, but so was contact, so was friendship, so was conversation. The relationship with the man, who I call the man because it was the most polite way I could think of addressing him, was a ultimately incredibly confusing relationship, because he did help me a lot with the grief that I had about my father. He did say to me very insightful things about grief and how to manage it and how to handle it, how I could protect my soul, myself from these very painful memories and thoughts. So he did help me, and I have to be fair and say I was quite wounded when I met him. But it only occurred to me much later that he was grooming me as well, in a way, for how to deal with his behavior, which was to teach me to forget pain, to teach me to alter my memories, to teach me that I never had to focus on anything that made me uncomfortable. I never had to confront it. I could put it away and keep going. I could live in the present moment without any real confrontation or reckoning of what the past meant. And so I believed him. I believed that he was doing things for my good, to help me. I was entranced in a way, as I write in the book. He was very much the opposite, absolutely. If I said something that upset him, he wouldn't talk to me. Not just in the middle of the conversation would he vanish, but he would withhold his conversation, his friendship, his, communion with me until I retreated. And that's a terrible response to dissent, and I had grown up with a father who, even though my father, I think, was very traditional in a certain respect, because he was of a certain generation, was incredibly liberal with me as a young girl. So I was never told girls didn't do X or Y. You know, I was never told girls had to talk a certain way. I was never told that you can't ask a question. I was never told you can't say when you're uncomfortable. And I didn't write about this in the book, but I remember when my father had returned to Pakistan and he had began his work in politics, he was putting together a manifesto. And I must have been 12, 13 years old. And he gave me the manifesto for his political party to read because he wanted to know what I thought about it. I mean, I barely understood it, to be honest, at that age. But I was, reading women's magazines and reading books. And I didn't feel he had addressed the issue of women in the manifesto. Where was reproductive rights? Where was contraception? Where was the right to choose? And I said this to him, and I could say it safely because I didn't think he would turn around and say to me, "You're 12. What do you care about women's reproductive rights?" And that was a great gift he gave me. And it's really why I'm a writer today, is because I feel I have a right to say certain things. But the relationship with the man, if I hadn't had the father I had, it might have scrubbed it out of me, to be honest.
And after your father died, you continued to live with your stepmother, didn't you? Did that relationship continue in the same vein as the relationship with your father?
No. I was very attached to my stepmother for a very long time. And I was also a very traumatized young girl because I had just lost effectively the only parent I ever knew. And there were similarities in the way her and the man behaved. There was a lot of conditionality. Looking back, this image I had built of myself as tough was kind of built in the face of a lot of submission. I hadn't the awareness to see it that way. But I had some experience with controlling relationships before the man. And because I lived with them and because I accepted them and they came from people I loved, I was probably well trained to accept that kind of behavior. And of course, I was younger. I would like to think I wouldn't accept that kind of behavior today. But, it's very hard to identify it when it's you. It's easy when a friend comes to you and tells you stories. You can step back and recognize things much quicker. But with yourself, and especially traumatized as I was always afraid that the people I loved would be taken from me. So that fear really was quite easy to manipulate, I think.
Yeah, because you had lived experience of that. So it wasn't a abstract fear. It was something that you had happened to you for a fact.
Yeah. I am by nature, I suppose, a bit of a worrier. I think the people who I've come across who have been controlling or exacted control have been very savvy about touching upon those fears. I don't want to wager why they might have done that. But living through it obviously leaves you, on shaky territory. And that's very difficult in a relationship, whatever kind of relationship it is.
This episode of The Shift is sponsored by Shopify. I can clearly remember starting The Shift. It's such a leap, isn't it? Going out there on your own, doing a new thing. I mean, what if it doesn't work? What if nobody listens? What if all the tech comes crashing down around me? Now, over 5 years and over 250 episodes later, I know different, of course. Starting The Shift was the best thing I ever did. And it helps to have a partner like Shopify on your side to help. For a start, they'll help you get the word out, like you have a whole marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. Shopify's your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to shipping, returns, everything. And if you get stuck, their award-winning 24/7 customer support is always around to advise. It's time to turn those what-ifs into... with Shopify today. Sign up for your £1 a month trial today at shopify.co.uk/shift. Go to shopify.co.uk/shift. That's shopify.co.uk/shift. Thinking about all the women that I know and have spoken to who have been in, abusive or coercive relationships, it's very often, including myself, there's very often a kind of a strength and a weakness that I'm going to say the men, I know it's not probably always men, but for the sake of this conversation, seem to be able to identify. And it seems to be a kind of a self-challenge to them.
Oh, yeah. I think there's challenges on both sides, isn't it? I think someone who is abusive, whether emotionally or psychologically or even physically, they need it. No, they need to break you to feel good or to feel something, perhaps. And then the challenge on the other end is that I can survive this. Or worse, I can fix them. I can fix them. They're in pain and I can fix them. And I fell prey to that thinking. And I think, there's something else, Sam. I think the reason a lot of women don't talk about this, perhaps, is also because we imagine everything is existing in a sort of hierarchy. So for a long time, I thought, I don't think it's fair to call what I went through very bad because it wasn't physical. It's not the same. But any relationship that humiliates you or that degrades you or that puts you down and makes you feel afraid, I think is a bad one. And we don't have to be, heroes about where we stand in the hierarchy of bad. Bad is bad.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think the use of the word coercive coming into more common usage is really beneficial in that way, because when it used to be domestic violence, I certainly remember when I was working on Red and we did a campaign, but it was with refuge. But at that point, the conversation was still around domestic violence, and there was an attempt to change it into relationship abuse, but it still encouraged that, like you say, that hierarchical thinking, like that person's pain is greater than my pain and mine doesn't count and I need to just be quiet.
I will say something that I think is really important. I think anyone who is coercive or controlling or has an abusive tendency to them they do one thing that's really important to pay note to. I think they check very early on your boundaries. And I think they check how far you will go, how much you will tolerate. Once they have a handle on that boundary of yours, then they can do all kinds of damage. And for me, this is the same whether it's emotional abuse or physical. They will always check how much you tolerate. And so the thing I always tell young women whenever I speak to them is anything that makes you uncomfortable, overreact. It's really better to overreact in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, because if you're wrong, you can always apologize and say, I'm really sorry, I felt really uncomfortable in this situation and I may have overreacted, but I had to protect myself. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist, so maybe I shouldn't be handing out advice, but I think that's safer than underreacting, because when you underreact to somebody who is coercive or controlling, the signal is, okay, I can do this and I can do it without too much complaint. And then they'll test a further border, a further boundary, and they'll push and push and push and push until they see when you will react. And that's very damaging. That's very damaging for us. So I would advise reacting immediately.
There's an anecdote in the book about running, actually, and it really leapt out at me when I read it, that the technique he teaches you for running to push yourself through the pain barrier is exactly the technique that he uses on you to stretch and bulldoze your boundaries.
When we began our relationship, he had said to me, you don't do enough exercise. You should exercise. Again, imagining I had a healthy self-esteem, didn't take offense to this commentary, because this is what made it confusing. He was often right. He often seemed to know me well, or seemed to know me better than I even felt I knew myself. So when he said to me, you should do more exercise, I didn't take it as a jab. I took it as, okay, maybe I'll feel good. And I did. I started to run. I'd never run before. And I really loved running. It really was a way for me to decompress, to put my thoughts away. And so many people who run will tell you that they become obsessed with it. And I did. And I hurt myself. I hurt my knees. I hurt my feet. And so the man, knowing all things, said to me, no, you don't stop running when you get hurt. You keep going. You don't stop for pain. You just have to trick yourself into not feeling the pain. Obviously, he said, don't run for a day or two, but then you get back at it. You don't give up. And the technique he taught me was that you set a signpost for yourself and you say, I'm going to run till that gate, or I'm going to run till that tree. And once you get to that tree, you erase that boundary and you say, no, I'm actually going to run to that bench, or I'm going to run to that car. And again, every time you hit your signpost, you erase it and you erase it and you erase it and you set it further and further and further and further. And like that, you keep going. And you can go much, much longer than you think possible using this. And, again, he was right. It's a very good technique. And it's what he used with me too. I was in my late 20s and throughout my 30s in the relationship, I wanted very much to be a mother. It was really my life's dream. And whenever I would say, if you don't want to settle down and you don't want children, then why are we together? We want very different things. He would say, well, maybe I will in 6 months. And I would think, oh, great, 6 months. Or he would say, well, next year, I think next year I might be ready for it. And next year would become 2 years or 3 years. If I had been more alert, maybe I would have noticed this earlier.
But you don't when you're in it. And I think, it's exactly what you were just talking about with the running. It's the incremental shifts of the goalposts. If, he had said, oh, in 5 years' time, you might have thought, well, I don't want to wait 5 years. Or I fear I can't wait 5 years or whatever. But 6 months, 6 months, 6 months, and then it's 5 years.
Yeah, that's the testing of the boundaries. That's the pushing the boundaries. And I really do think women have to, we talk about red flags, but what's a red flag? Whenever I've read descriptions of red flags, they're like immediately violent and horrible, right? And so, of course, you can say, oh, no, that's never happened to me. But actually, once that happens, that's not a flag, that's violence. Before that are the flags. And the flags are things that we don't think of as violent. We don't think of as destructive or damaging. And they truly are. And again, they're flags because they're confusing. I remember one incident, just to stick on the running theme. I must have not just started, but I must have been 6 months, a year into the running obsession. And we happened to be walking in a park and it was nice weather. And the man said to me, yeah, you get hurt when you run because you're not running properly, maybe. He showed me how you run. And I was like, well, I'm not dressed I was wearing sandals, I'm not dressed for running. And he said, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You run now. I thought I had my bag. And he had this ability to always want to instruct. And so I was curious and I thought, yeah, maybe I'm doing something wrong. And I remember he had me running barefoot when I couldn't run in my sandals anymore. And he was running too. We were both kind of running. So I was thinking, what a wonderful time we're having here. But I was uncomfortable, my feet hurt. I was stepping on rocks and he was saying, no, keep going. You're very good. You've got great endurance. And I kind of, now looking back, I think, what was I doing? What was I doing running barefoot with my sandals cutting my feet just because someone told me that I could learn something, that I could improve, that I could be better? And so I really had to rethink so many things, not just about myself. I had to look at myself quite hard in the mirror and wonder what was this toxic self-esteem that allowed me to put myself in not good situations for someone's time or affection or approval. And it really was uncomfortable.
I was thinking when I interviewed Bella Freud, she said something similar, but which boiled down to, if it feels wrong, it is wrong. And I think it takes a really, 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 really long time to learn that.
Well, I also don't think the culture, and I mean this globally, the culture that women are forced to survive in does not teach them this. It doesn't teach us this. The culture teaches women to be polite, and it teaches women not to make a scene, and it teaches women to put themselves behind other people's needs. To be a certain kind of woman means certain kinds of things. I really do think that has harmed generations of women. Why do we have this idea? It's not that we invented it. I think we've seen it in films. We've seen it in books. We've seen it in the women around us. It's pointless, Of course, there are things men have very wrong in their culture too. Even someone like me who had to defend themselves from a young age and had to be put in uncomfortable situations. even I was taught to a degree to look after other people at the cost of myself, because that's what women do. They nurture. Just as Bella said, if it feels wrong, it is. If you're in a relationship where you're unhappy most of the time, it's not a good relationship, however great you imagine the person to be.
It was the having a family ultimately that led you out, didn't it?
Yes, it was. It was also when I saw that he was cruel, not to me. It was a very jarring experience. That did wake me up. But also, I very much wanted to be a mother. I very much wanted, as long as I can remember, I wanted to have children. I wanted to be a mother. I'm sure there are many reasons that was my greatest longing. I had a lovely relationship with my father, and I know that we sustained each other. And I know that in his short life, he brought me so much joy and happiness. And I know I did the same for him. And I wanted to do that again. I wanted to do that for someone else. I wanted very much to have a child. And again, I think this is something not unique to me at all, but he didn't, and didn't want to lose what I offered, which was love and attention and companionship. And so he wasted a lot of my time, and I hung on because I thought he'll change. I can change it. And it was very belatedly, I thought everything else. I thought, oh God, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe. And it was very, very late when I had this thought one day, and it just went off like a bulb. And I thought, oh, what if I'm being protected? What if I'm being saved here? What if I'm not meant to be in this relationship with this person? And this is offering me a door out, offering me a door out, offering me a door out, and I should take it.
I mean, that is one of the many. I mean, Coco is, you now have 3 dogs, don't you? I'm going to give you the relief of talking about dogs now for a moment.
They're beasts. They're in another room because they would be very much a part of this conversation if they were in this room.
We're animal friendly. But the cruelty you mentioned was, amongst other things, in relation to Coco, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, I write about it in the book. It was difficult to write about, but I think animals, and I talk about other animals in the book too, and our relationship with animals and the wild. But for me, are so special to me because of their tenderness, because of their innocence, because dogs love, and they love against their own interest. They love their humans no matter what the human does to them. They forgive them, they love them, they follow them, they're loyal to them. And so to see cruelty to a dog, to see cruelty to an animal that is so generous and so adoring, it's like when you see cruelty to children. It just is unbearable to watch for me. I cannot. One of his most attractive qualities was that I always thought that he was great with dogs. And then I saw a flicker of something else, and I could never unsee it. I know that everyone is human and everyone has their moments. I just can't bear to see things done in unkindness to animals.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
But I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So when you did leave him, I mean, he was the classic, wasn't it? Once you've actually shown that he's reached a point where you're not going to be pushed any further, then he tried to get you back. Classic. But once you had left, that your relationship with Coco was integral, wasn't it, into your rebuilding?
Yes, because I did have to think at some point. At the time I was 40. I had spent, all of my 30s waiting for something that never happened. And I couldn't really blame anyone but myself, COVID, don't forget, also popped up in the middle. So women of my generation had always been told, build a career, focus on your career. You can have it all. There's time for everything. And then COVID was a really rude awakening that you couldn't, because we'd spent all that time building careers. And now here we were stuck at home and unable to go out, to see people, to be with a community. And so I felt really quite dispirited, I guess is the word. I felt really dispirited. And I had to think, I don't want to go through life dispirited. And I had to think, well, okay, maybe I don't have the life I dreamed of. What can I do then? I thought, well, I've got these creatures to look after. And they were like children. They really are like children, I have to say. And they needed me and I needed them. We provided each other shelter from the difficulties of everything else. And I thought, okay, well, that's all right. I'll have dogs. And I think my friends had already written me off because, once you've got 3 dogs, you're verging into odd territory. And I thought, yeah, that's fine. I could have a few more. I'll adopt. I'll look after them. I was hopeful that it would be enough, though I really did want more. But they've been just great joys, and they've taught me so much. And it's been a pleasure of my life to have shared it with these dignified, beautiful, beautiful creatures.
You mentioned your friends then. When you were going through the kind of your 30s, did he do the classic thing of kind of separating you a bit from your friends? What was your friends' perspectives on it?
It was a coercive relationship, and it was controlling. And it was controlling to the degree that he essentially said to me, your life with me is separate than your life with your friends and your family and everything. And I don't want to be a part of that. And it was a very odd situation. But to be honest, I'd never really had quite a conventional life. So, I lived in different places. I traveled a lot. I had a kind of nomadic setup that was unusual. And so I accepted it, thinking it allowed me to maintain a certain kind of space for myself and a certain sort of independence. So my friends largely didn't know. They were not, I kept it from them. I probably knew deep down what they would say. But at the same time, I really only managed to survive all of it because of my friends. Because my friends were reminders of what love is, of what care is, of what it means to care for each other, and how it's essential for us in this lonely world to have the warmth of that care. But I do also think that's probably why I wrote this book, because I really wouldn't want young me to go through that again. I don't want anyone, young or old, to have to go through that kind of thing quietly and in silence, because you will, because you don't want to talk about something you're ashamed of. It's all the things I wish I could have said, the hour of the wolf. If I could have spoken freely at the time, that's what I would have told the people I loved.
I mean, you've written fiction and you've written memoir. What do you think you'll do next? You must be at a point now where you can't put yourself through any more memoir.
I never even thought of The Hour of the Wolf as a memoir. I just was calling it a book. And then I saw it described as memoir, and I thought, that's very strange. I didn't write a memoir.
I think you did.
Yeah, I might have done. I love both. I mean, I love fiction for the escape that it gives you. And I love it for the ability to build a world in which, a secret world, that's not a dangerous world. It's a secret world that you can experiment in and withdraw to and imagine. But at the same time, I am the kind of writer that processes what they feel by writing. And so nonfiction appeals to me as well. It appeals to me to look into something, to look into the things I don't have answers to and to spend time with them. So I don't really know, to be honest, at this point. I mean, even when you write fiction, it's always a bit lived, isn't it? It's always something you can't process on your own. So I'll have to wait and see. I'm not ready yet.
No, no.
Mm.
Do you think you could have written The Hour of the Wolf if your life hadn't moved on as much as it has?
No. I was wary of the things women are told, so when I got out of the relationship and I felt really not well, I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel like myself. I didn't even know what myself was. And of course, friends told me, and, people who love me told me, don't worry. It's going to happen for you. You'll move on. You'll be fine. You'll have children. You'll be a mother. And I didn't dare believe them, but I did. And I still can't believe my luck, but I did find someone who undid a lot of the damage of the man, who was kind, who was caring, who was really, truly a partner. And we have 2 little boys. And I think it's only because I had the safety of someone who truly was with me, come what may, who I wasn't anymore on my own, if that makes sense. I mean, I don't mean like physically alone. I just mean if I fell, someone would help me get up. That I was able to sit down and think about telling the full story and about confronting what made me ashamed. It doesn't mean that, finding a man made me less ashamed. No, I mean, I'm still ashamed of all that. It just means I finally felt safe enough to look at what had hurt me. And I have boys now as well, so I don't want not to think, I have to think about this, because I don't want my boys growing up and wreaking havoc because the person who should have taught them what love means didn't think hard enough about how we love and what it means to love someone. So I felt safe, even though it was uncomfortable. And that's the only reason I could have written this. Yeah. For a long while, I had a draft of this book in a desk, and it was many different drafts of this book. It was many different kinds of books. No, this one wouldn't have worked.
How long was it in your desk, taking shape?
It was in my desk probably about 3 years, not working. And then, in fact, it was the month before I found out I was pregnant with Mir, with my first son, that I sat down. I was actually going to sit down and work on a novel. And I had a draft of a novel that I had to fix. And I sat down to work on that novel. And every day I never opened the file. I opened this file. And I would look at it and look at it and look at it. And in that month, in a kind of fever, I wrote down what became The Hour of the Wolf. And I didn't, and then the next month I found out I was pregnant and I wasn't, feeling well and all that. And so I told myself, okay, I'm just going to leave it here for a bit and I'll see how I feel about it. Maybe I won't feel good about it. And if I don't feel good about it, I'll just leave it in my desk. But I kept opening the file. And so finally I thought, okay, maybe this is a book. And it is now, finally.
It is. It is definitely a book. And so now you're into your 40s. What does that look like? How does it feel?
Well, it is true what a lot of women told me, that you do feel better in your 40s. You do feel better. It's strange. I guess being a child of the 80s, we had, this impression of like life begins at 30. I hated my 30s. I was miserable all of my 30s because it was such a period of destabilization. I felt really vulnerable and cracked apart during my 30s. But I'm really happy to be in my 40s, and I'm happy for 2 reasons. I think it's a blessing to be able to age. I lost people I love very young. My father was younger than me when he was killed. Father had just turned 42 when he was killed. I'm 43 now. So I think it's a gift that I'm thankful for every day. But also, it's been a really wonderful lesson in how little we know to be this age and realize I don't know anything. And that's quite, I don't know, invigorating. I love that. I love that I don't know, because there's so much that's possible. There's so much that I can find out. I didn't have that feeling when I was younger. When I was younger, I felt I had to know everything. or I would fail. And now I don't have that. Now I don't have that anxiety. And that's been really quite liberating.
I agree. I think in your 20s and 30s, not knowing, it's like you almost can't admit that there's anything you don't know. And then when you get into your 40s and then 50s, that all starts to feel like an opportunity.
Totally. It's not just an opportunity. It's one of the pleasures of life, I think, you know. If I think about all the things I've been able to discover simply by surrendering that I don't know anything, I feel so lucky. I feel so privileged. And, you know, the world we live in, I feel, has never felt to me more terrifying at the same time. I really also am unable to look at the news to see what's happening in Gaza and not thank the universe or whatever powers there are that we are here, we are alive, we get old, we learn, we fail, you know. Oh, how can we complain? All we can do is just be grateful, be grateful, be grateful.
On that note, I'm going to take a really serious conversation and ask you a whole bunch of really flippant questions that I always ask at the end. Just completely inappropriate, so I do apologize.
Totally.
What is your emotional age?
In my head, I think I'm 28, but I think my emotional age is probably where I am nowish. I would say something in the 40s. I think it's a little less than it was when I was younger. And that's been the defining characteristic of this decade so far.
Give us a book recommendation. So it can be a lifelong favorite or a new favorite. It can be cookbook, can be fiction, non-fiction, poetry, anything.
I just read a book by Tariq Bakoni called Fire in Every Direction. That's also a memoir. It's a coming-of-age memoir. It's a queer memoir. And I thought it was a really brave book. And I hope it travels far and wide in the world because I think it will give a lot of people strength. So I would recommend Tariq's book. I also just read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. And that's a novel. And it was just such a pleasure to be in a novel again and to lose yourself outside of the real world. So I would definitely recommend that as well.
Right. What advice would you give younger women?
The advice I would give younger women is that we tend to think of people in controlling relationships or people that have in coercive relationships. We tend to put up with the pain because we think they are exceptional people, that they are special people. And the truth is they are absolutely generic, absolutely generic. So if you're listening to this podcast and you think your partner or your parent or your coworker sounds like this, they are this. They're all the same. They have the same playbook. There's nothing special about them. Run.
That is excellent advice. Who is an older woman who's inspired you?
My best friend, who I write about in The Hour of the Wolf, Allegra. I think she might kill me for calling her an older woman who inspires me because it's unclear. Sometimes she feels like an older sister. Sometimes she feels like a younger sister. And I feel like the older sister. Allegra has inspired me because she is a person of true goodness and grace. And I see in her actions what it means to be kind and how that is a strength, not a weakness. And I often tell her that she makes me a better person. And I do think that's true because she's incredibly soft. She has none of the pretensions I have about wanting to be tough. You know, she totally accepts what is delicate and vulnerable about her. And that's been very important for me to learn as a woman.
What's your superpower?
My superpower is that I communicate well with beings that are in pain. I see them somehow, and I think they see me.
And last one, how many fucks do you give?
Oh, 0. I thought you said, how many books do you have? I thought, oh my God, how am I going to count how many books I have? Oh, 0, absolutely 0. And that's another great thing about being in my 40s. If I would never have written this book in my 30s, I would have at least given 1 or 2, and I don't anymore.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.